The sun poured over the village green of much dithering, casting its warm light on the bunting stalls and polished silver teapotses, glinting under striped awnings. It was the annual summer fete hosted, as always, by Lady Sybil Marchmont on the grounds. Of her ivor-covered manor, children darted between sponge cake competitions and sack races. The local Vicar Reverend George cheerfully judged the jam entries, though he looked slightly pale after tasting Mrs. Plumstead's brandy surprise, and amid it all, like a modest centerpiece to the chaos, sat Miss Marple in a folding chair with a thin crochet blanket across her lap. She was not as frail as she looked, though she happily let others believe so, her blue eyes sharp beneath the brim of her sun hat scanned the crowd with quiet precision. She noticed the way Sybil's cousin Battle Marchmont stood apart from the others near the rose arbor, his jaw-set arms folded. Sybil's voice, always sharp-edged, had taken on a falsely jovial tone as she introduced her niece, Clara, to the local solicitor. Clara, for her part, seemed eager to escape the conversation. It was all quite ordinary, and that was what troubled Miss Marple. Colonel Hayward, who was quietly grunting as he settled into the chair next to her, remarked, "These garden parties tend to blend together, don't they?" To which Miss Marple responded, "Not quite. Each one has its own flavour," as she slightly clenched her fists around her teacup. As Jane and Miss Marple smiled, the Colonel chuckled, his eyes fixed on the people across the lawn. Suddenly there was a clatter, and everyone's attention was drawn to the scene. A porcelain plate had fallen from someone's hand, and the Marshal stood over the shards, his expression a mix of amusement and concern. What caught Miss Marple's attention, though, was not the plate itself, but the lack of immediate assistance from anyone else. The atmosphere was tense, like the moments leading up to a storm, emanating from the bandstand. A warbling version of Greensleeves by Mrs. Penelope Watts drew kind applause as she began to perform. Miss Marple observed that Sybil's face tensed up slightly with each out-tubbed keynote. Sybil was the type of woman who insisted on perfection in all aspects of her life, including her family, her home, and her events. Lady Sybil's controlled and powerful voice sounded out as she stated, "I would like to say a few words before we conclude this lovely afternoon." By 3 o'clock, the judging of the flower arrangements was complete. The sherry had started to flow, and gossip had found its natural pace. Sybil, with her crimson dress ruffling like a pulled curtain, stepped onto the small wooden stage as the crowd went silent. I remember she mumbled something about how time for changes is upon us. There was a tremor in the audience as I made certain. Decisions regarding the future of Marchmont House and its inheritance. Basil and Clara shared a glance before the anxious Sybil continued speaking. Miss Marple, however, became fixated on the tightening of grips, nervous adjustments of hats, and sidelong glances. She had noticed similar patterns in St. Mary's. During moments when money or titles were brought up, such topics had a way of bringing out the buried and bitter. When Sybil finished speaking, there was polite, thin applause, but Miss Marple chose not to clap. Instead, she looked up at the sky, and she heard the distant crack of the first roll of thunder. "A storm is coming," Colonel Hayward declared. The answer was yes, as Miss Marple whispered, "in more ways than one." That evening, long after the garden party had ended and Lady Sybil had returned to her drawing-room with her decanter of port, the village of much dithering began to quiet. Once more, but beneath the surface, the air still hummed with something unsaid. By morning the peace would be shattered. Chapter 2. By dawn the village awoke to rain-slicked cobblestones and low-hanging clouds that smothered the rooftops of much dithering. Like grey wool birds chirped in short, uncertain bursts. before falling silent again at Marchmont House. The shutters were still drawn, and the gravel drive sat undisturbed save for the solitary bicycle of Dr. Lionel Pierce, its frame leaning against the gate like a crooked question mark. Inside, silence pressed heavily on the drawing-room. The maid Nora had entered with a tray of beer. Lady Sybil Marchmont sat in her beloved armchair by the fireplace, dressed in the same crimson as the day before, her head tilted slightly to one side and her eyes were half lit. The port decanter next to her was uncorked and her glass stood empty. Instead of screaming, Nora retreated from the room, her face turning chalk white. The butler, Mr. Kellam, discovered her trembling in the hallway, her hands firmly gripping her apron as if it were a lifeline. By 8 o'clock, word had already reached the High Street, and by half it had reached Miss Marple, who was in the village grocer's, choosing a modest wheel of Wydale. Mrs. Duncan, her breath scented with peppermint, whispered, "Gone, poor thing," in the drawing-room no less. Mrs. Duncan blinked and asked, "Excuse me," after Nora mentioned how stiff she was, saying that the port was to blame. Miss Marple nodded slightly and said, "How sad Lady Sybil did enjoy her port, though I believe she was more fond of control than intoxication." "Oh, absolutely not," Miss Marple remarked as she paid for her cheese. "The problem is that the majority of people do have a tendency to relax their grip towards the end. Sybil has always seemed to be the polar opposite. As she made her way home with her basket in tow, she passed the Marchmont gates and encountered 2 rigid constables beneath the portico. One of them acknowledged her presence and lowered his hat in a show of respect. Miss Marple merely smiled politely and continued walking, but her thoughts were consumed by the impending death at Marchmont House. Shortly after a pointed announcement regarding the estate, Inspector Cray, a towering man with a salt and pepper moustache and an unblinking gaze, arrived from Guildingford. He interviewed the staff, beginning with Nora, who was visibly shaken, Mr. Kellam, whose precision was matched by a metronome, and Cook, who kept wiping her eyes even though she admitted she had never liked the woman in the drawing-room. The body had already been removed, but Inspector Cray stood by the drinks table, scowling at the half-empty port decanter. There was no sign of struggle, forced entry, unusual bruises or scratch marks, and no unusual bruises or scratches. With his arms folded, Dr. Pierce stood at his side, an undiagnosing heart failure. "That's funny how that fits Craig's," grunted. "Convenience, isn't it?" Right after she openly proposed revising her will. She had high blood pressure and complained of shortness of breath for weeks. Pierce furrowed his brow. "Someone may have snuck something into her port, in my opinion." No sooner had the story been told than Miss Marple was visited by an unannounced guest. Clara Marchmont, with her crimson-rimmed eyes and drenched umbrella, stood at the cottage doorstep and whispered, "I apologize for disturbing you, Miss Marple. May I come inside?" "Of course, my dear." As they made their way to the sitting-room, Miss Marple sat quietly with her hands folded, offering her tea. "I suppose it's awful to say, but I'm not surprised," Clara whispered. "Your Aunt Sybil was difficult. She held everyone at arm's length, even me." Miss Marple gently reminded Clara that she appeared nervous yesterday. During her aunt's little speech, Clara hesitated because she knew what was coming. "The night before, she told me that she intended to change her will. She said that Basil wouldn't approve, and that she would rather leave Marchmont House to a charity rather than him. You, my dear, if you were to inherit anything—" Clara looked down only a trust fund. "I never expected more." As Miss Marple observed, the girl was obviously grieving, but there was also an underlying sense of shame, dread, and guilt. After A moment of quiet reflection. Clara completed her tea and left, having promised to call again soon. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple found herself absorbed in her crocheting. Her mind wandered to a teacup, a glass of port, and a woman who had ensnared those closest to her. Dr. Pierce's diagnosis seemed reasonable, but something about the woman made her instincts tingle with unease. The scene outside the door brought a sense of calm as Clara sat motionless, her expression betraying her fear. Sybil, seemingly unmoved, stood poised as always, even in death. Then there was a knock at the door. It was Inspector Cray. He introduced himself and said, "Evening, Miss Marple. I thought I'd pay you the courtesy of a word. We found nothing suspicious. The doctor says the case may be closed due to natural causes." While wearing her specs, Miss Marple glanced up at what could be yes, or perhaps not quite. "Do you believe it was murder?" he asked with a subtle smirk. With a return to crocheting, Miss Marple said, "I believe Lady Sybil Marchmont never did anything without reason, including dying. Section 3, only close friends, village dignitaries, and the extended Marchmont family were invited to the modest wake that was organized with brittle efficiency by Mr. Kellam. The atmosphere inside was not one of mourning, but of restraint. Voices were hushed, movement was stiff, and gossip had always been an uncomfortable bedfellow. The house reopened 3 days after Lady Sybil's death, under a softer, more solemn air, with heavy curtains drawn against the summer sun and vases of lilies, placed on polished tables as a display of grief that smelt too strong and bloomed too quickly. At 3 minutes to 3, Miss Marple showed up, dressed subdued in grey and adorned with delicate black gloves. She nodded to the vicar and offered a kind word to Clara, who appeared noticeably thinner than 3 days ago. With her hands lightly resting on her handbag, she settled into a seat near the fireplace, clearly not interested in staying near the refreshments. What she came for was conversation, and the awkward silences that followed. "What a terrible business," whispered Mrs. Tudley, a round woman dressed in lavender taffeta. It was unexpected, but not totally unexpected. Miss Marple asked delicately, "Well, my darling Sybil, you haven't exactly been yourself as of late." Sybil confided in my husband about how she thought her family was encircling her like crows, discussing terrible topics like betrayals and their consequences. Miss Marple arched an eyebrow, which is a metaphor I found puzzling as well. However, as you may know, Sybil is quite dramatic, and she is rarely mistaken about her intuition. Basil Marchmont stood by the bar, whispering to a solicitor called Mr. Hartridge. Basil maintained a stiff posture and a clipped tone throughout. Every so often he glanced across to Clara, who sat alone, her gaze fixated on the carpeting. Militarily positioned next to a pot of coffee, Miss Marple rose silently and made her way to the serving table. Mr. Kellam stood there. "Such a fine gathering, Mr. Kellam," she pointed out. Lady Sybil would have approved. He lowered his head slightly as he said, "In death, Miss Marple valued propriety." "Tell me," she said softly, "did she take her port alone?" That evening Kellam hesitated, only briefly. "Yes, ma'am. She dismissed the staff early, said she wanted time to herself, unusual." He met her gaze unblinking. "Very did she often entertain visitors?" "Late, no ma'am." Miss Marple turned the cup in her hand thoughtfully. "And the decanter, was it left out overnight?" "Yes. I found it just as the maid did. Unusual, again, quite miss." Marple returned to her chair, but remained standing a moment longer, observing the room. It was not Clara or Basil who caught her attention, nor the solicitor, nor the gossiping villagers. It was a woman she hadn't seen at the garden party, tall, thin, with a pale scarf knotted tightly round her throat. The woman stood near. the stairwell saying little and watching everyone. Miss Marple crossed over. "Forgive me," she said gently. "I don't believe we've met." The woman offered a faint smile. "Else Denholm. I was Sybil's companion once long ago. We travelled together when she was younger. Egypt, Morocco, places she never spoke of here." Miss Marple nodded. "She rarely spoke of anything beyond the village, I believe, and yet she chose to reach quite far in her last days." Elizabeth's eyes flicked sideways. "She wrote me just before the fate asked me to come. Said she feared something was going to happen." Miss Marple's voice lowered. "Did she mention what she only said?" Elizabeth hesitated, as if considering the words someone would find her end before making her choice. Miss Marple scowled, indicating that this was not a phrase that Sybil Marchmont would use lightly. With that, she went back to her seat, and her thoughts began to form an uncomfortable shape. Shortly after, Inspector Cray arrived, nodded at a few familiar faces, and sat down beside the fireplace. The silence grew heavier as he started to speak. Despite Dr. Pierce ruling the death as natural, the circumstances remain noteworthy. Lady Sybil had recently informed several people of her plans to amend her will, as is customary procedure. "We are reviewing the estate's legal documents and financial holdings, and is there an official inquiry?" As he adjusted his spectacles, Inspector Hartridge inquired. "Have you?" Despite Cray's fair response, "There are a few discrepancies that need more investigation." Inconsistencies were stirred by Clara. Curly glanced across at Miss Marchmont. "You will inherit the trust. Mr. Basil Marchmont will receive the house and estate." And Basil remained silent as the room buzzed softly. "Since your aunt's new will was never submitted to her lawyers, the previous will, which was dated 3 years ago, remains in effect." As guests began to leave the wake, Miss Marple found herself back by Elizabeth Denham's side. "Will you be staying in the village for long?" Marple asked in a perky tone. Elizabeth nodded, and Marple watched Clara's face for a mixture of sadness and a more subdued expression of disappointment or resignation. Elizabeth's expression was one of severe anticipation as she cast her gaze past Miss Marple and towards Marchmont House, her jaw dropping in anticipation. Chapter 4 takes place the morning after the wake, when the executors were summoned by the Marchmont solicitor, Mr. Hartridge, to his office on Church Street. The brick building was narrow and sandwiched between the post office and the milliner's shop. The windows hadn't been cleaned since the last general election. Miss Marple had no business being there, but at 10 o'clock, she was found leisurely browsing the hats next door, her ear delicately cocked towards the solicitor's wall within. Hartridge cleared his throat and unwrapped a sheath of cream-coloured papers before Clara, Battle, and Elizabeth Denham, who had been invited at Battle's insistence, though no one exactly knew why the will in force. Partridge proceeded to date in March of 1952. Lady Markman's estate was divided as follows. £10,000 went to Miss Clara Marchmont to be held in trust until she turned 30. The rest of Marchmont House lands and holdings went to Mr. Battle Marchmont. Basil remained silent, but his eyes darted to her for an uncomfortable moment. There had been talk of a revised will, but no one had submitted or found it, so the original one stands. Clara asked quietly, "What happened to the draft? I knew Aunt Sybil had been writing letters, but I don't know if she shared it with you. Maybe she kept it with someone else, but after searching her writing desk, we found nothing." It seemed unusual for a woman as fastidious as Sybil to look at her cottage while Miss Marple listened through the tiny divider between the stores and maid. A mental note that no one had known she intended to have a new will, yet many individuals had. A woman who dreaded not love, a promise of transformation now silenced, a death elegantly presented as natural, and a will once spoken of publicly now erased as though it never was, were all specimens in Miss Marple's memory, organized in rows like specimens under glass. Inspector Cray paid her another unexpected visit that afternoon. Miss Marple took it as a compliment, but he actually came unannounced and without a pretext. She certainly made life difficult, he said, accepting the cup of tea she had handed him. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her voice heavy with thought. I wonder why a woman so deliberate would leave no written trace of her new intentions unless she expected someone to destroy them. Cray leaned forward as if the will had been dissolved. Miss Marple delicately remarked that whomever stood to lose the most had every incentive to keep it hidden. That evening, Clara went back to Marchmont House by herself. The servants had been sent home for the night, so the halls were empty and echoed. She moved slowly through them, as if anticipating her aunt's clipped voice at any moment. In the drawing-room, a neat stack of condolence letters had been organized by Mr. Kellam. Clara picked one at random and opened it without looking. Her fingers froze as she noticed an envelope inside, not addressed. The neat handwriting was from Lady Sybil, but there was no stamp or seal. The house must not go to Basil. Clara's breath caught as she turned the letter over, but there was no signature or date, even a single sentence that is direct, severe, urgent, and obvious. Quickly folding the note and slipping it into her coat pocket, Clara swung round to see who was in the hall when she heard a creaking floorboard. There was no response, only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Arriving at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after daybreak the following morning, Clara's coat was still damp with dew. She handed the letter over to Miss Marple, who silently read it while knitting her brow. The letter did not contain a stamp or date. I can tell that's Clara's handwriting since she whispered it. Miss Marple nodded in agreement, but I can't help but wonder if this is a letter she never sent, concealed amid the condolences, as if she were hoping someone would discover it, but not so soon, because she probably was afraid someone would. Rummage through her belongings. As I folded the page, Miss Marple spoke. Lady Sybil had a far better grasp of her enemy than everyone else. Clara was hesitant at the door. Was it Basil? Miss Marple remained silent and instead spoke, asking, Have you ever noticed, my dear, that when people stand to inherit a great deal, they become quite expert at waiting? With a grimace, Clara asked, What do you mean? However, the things one wants to vanish are frequently the ones that bear the marks of impatience. Chapter 5. The rain came back the following morning, this time relentlessly pounding on the windows of homes and businesses as if attempting to whisper something important. Sitting at her kitchen table, Miss Marple stared at the letter from Clara, which she compared to a partially buried seed that, if left unattended, would blossom into something darker. After measuring 8 words, she lifted the letter up to the light. The parchment was of great quality, and the ink was slightly faded. Despite the lack of a stamp or date, the script was legible. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, and took another look at the envelope. There was no seal, no address, and no fold creases, which meant it had never been posted or even prepared for delivery. It was apparently a message meant to be found later, only if Sybil failed to protect herself. By mid-morning, she had made her way through the village to Dr. Lionel Pierce's home, but this was no social visit. He greeted her with his usual brisk politeness, though his eyes briefly glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece, a subtle indication that he had appointments pending. Forgive the intrusion. He poured himself a little glass of water and remarked, You know, Lady Sybil had chronic hypertension, not unusual for her age, but she was careful. Miss Marple sat primly in the armchair across from his desk, but he had been thinking about Lady Sybil's health, and yet she took port before bed. Miss Marple added, closely observing him, "You said it yourself, fit was common so, I suppose." It's not surprising that she shifted, yes, in moderation. Miss Marple placed the letter delicately on the table between them. "What if I told you she suspected someone intended harm?" Mr. Pierce nodded. "She was quite obsessive about her blood pressure. Does that mean your diagnosis is shifting?" The doctor paused, the room growing stuffy like a drawn curtain. Then he spoke. "That handwriting is hers." Miss Marple nodded once, deliberately. Pierce scratched his chin. "We might have to re-evaluate our beliefs. Since there were no obvious signs of trauma or poisoning, no residue on her glass, and no recent complaints from her, I signed the certificate in good faith. However, Pierce's scowl deepened, and I will discreetly contact the coroner's office to inquire about any abnormalities in her blood work that we might have missed." As Miss Marple departed from the house, her attention shifted from the letter's contents to its whereabouts. She wondered who had handled the sympathy notes before Clara, the butler, the maid, or someone else who wanted it hidden in plain sight, where it might be easily overlooked or dismissed when returned to the village. Sitting alone in the reading room of the Marchmont Library, Clara combed through her aunt's old notebooks, calendars, and marginalia in her search for anything that could shed light on the disappearing will or the context of the letters. Eventually, she came across a ripped corner of stationery tucked beneath a stack of gardening catalogues. At first glance, it appeared insignificant, but the date at the top caught her attention. Sybil passed away just 2 days later, on July 14th, and there was a scribbled word in the margin that needed to be revised and kept in a safe until it was finalized. Elizabeth Denholm, who was accompanied by Clara, got up from her seat and hurriedly made her way to the village, where someone else had taken refuge. The rain had intensified, and by the time she reached her destination, her coat was drenched. Elizabeth cautiously unzipped her silk robe, saying, "I apologize for interrupting." After a moment of hesitation, Clara asked, "Did my aunt give you any papers or anything?" Elizabeth's expression remained unchanged as she responded, "No. I'm sure she wrote here." Clara then revealed a torn note, explaining that Elizabeth had intended to leave a draft with you to be kept safe. Elizabeth carefully examined the scrap before raising her eyes to look up at the note. "I don't know what to think," Elizabeth whispered. She was frightened, which Elizabeth had previously denied. As Elizabeth whispered, she wasn't someone who ever admitted fear, but she did. Then she told me to stay close in case something happened. But she never said why. My heart sank. About a little silence, Elizabeth explained, "You're not the only one who's been asking after her things. He arrived the morning after Elizabeth passed away, claimed he needed to gather personal items, insisted on personally searching through her desk, instructed Kellum to leave him be and returned to her cottage," and Clara stared, her mouth hanging wide. Elizabeth's voice nearly plummeted to a whisper. "Inspector Cray called Miss Marple briefly. They've scheduled a discreet post-mortem for 48 hours. Miss Marple checked the garden path through the window. There were no traces of the rain, and Sybil left warnings, but Cray remained silent, apparently afraid of Basil. Miss Marple hung up the phone and went back to her armchair. The will was missing, the warning unsent, so the wrong person inherited everything. Someone had touched the pages, and someone else almost missed them. She didn't accuse him, but she did leave breadcrumbs. A letter, a note to Clara, and a mention to Elizabeth. Why was Inspector Cray so cautious? If she had named him directly and nothing had happened to her, she would have invited war. In Chapter 6, the sun rose again the following morning, highlighting the village and its verdant hedges. The chimneys puffed out in a monotonous pattern, adding to the illusion of calm. However, at Marchmont House, the tranquility was only on the surface. Clara could feel a shift in the air, a heavy silence pressing against the windows. She had kept the letter and torn note from Basil, maybe because she anticipated his reaction, cold rejection, a hurtful comment, or an abrupt need to move on. Clara directed her energy where she believed it would have the most impact. Miss Marple, do you think he destroyed the will? On that morning, as they strolled along the gravel path behind St. Michael's Church, Clara asked her directly. A flock of crows swooped down from the trees overhead, their calls breaking the silence. Miss Marple took a while to respond, but eventually she said something along the lines of how Basil wouldn't have waited so long to act if he had really believed he had lost his inheritance. Lady Sybil, though, was cunning. She said very little, but implied a lot. She may have set more than one trap. As Clara glanced at her, she wondered if there was another clue. I thought maybe there was something unseen. She trusted you and someone else. Maybe even me, though I do flatter myself. But the one she didn't trust could have held the key back at Marchmont House, where Basil was issuing orders. After a short hiatus, Sybil's housekeeper, Mrs. Drum, was back and supervising the rearranging of her possessions. I want the library emptied out by Friday, and there were boxes lining the corridor, some sealed and half full of letters, ledgers, and photographs. Throw out anything that doesn't appear important, and if anything is personal or old, it goes to the attic. You'll find the library rather bare, I'm afraid, Basil said, clearing things out, quite a process. Miss Marple, who was visiting quietly, under the pretense of borrowing a book that Sybil had promised her, arrived just in time to witness this little scene. Basil greeted her with mechanical politeness. A stack of books sat on the windowsill. Among them was a gardening almanac with a folded page. Miss Marple opened it delicately, and an annotation caught her eye. He's too eager to presume, so delay is my only defense. Basil's smile froze as she spoke, but she had already passed him inside the library. The fire was unlit, and a musty odor clung to the carpet, which was unusual for a room that had once been meticulously cleaned. A small stack of books remained on the bookshelf. As Clara slipped into the room, Sybil knew she was treading carefully. She closed the book as soon as she spoke. I've been through her drawers again, Clara whispered. Nothing more, not a trace of the draft, but I did find something odd. The tone of the note was identical to the previous one, deliberate and aware. A little piece of wrinkled and somewhat discolored paper was pulled out of her coat and presented to Miss Marple. The paper itself was unimpressive, but what attracted her eye was the name inscribed in block letters near the top. Belladonna and Atropur, Limited, administered under a medical license, was acquired by Miss Marple with narrowed eyes from Hawthorne's Pharmacy, Guildingford, Brancher, on a receipt dated 2 days prior to Sybil's death. She delicately spoke the words, "That's very serious." She failed to clarify that the medicine is typically provided in minute dosages for pain or, on rare occasions, as a sedative. According to Clara, I discovered the slide under the carpet on the stairs and the loose edge in the corner. Miss Marple's mind immediately went to, "Do you still have the port bottle?" asked Sybil, who had secretly acquired a potentially harmful chemical, leading one to wonder if she had ever used it herself, or if someone had used it against her. Unexpectedly, she inquired, prompting Clara to blink and respond. Yes, it's in the pantry. Seal it, hide it, and do not mention this to Basil. We missed it, Inspector Cray mumbled, scratching his temple. It wasn't logged. Dr. Pierce didn't prescribe it. He confirmed that himself. Later that night, Miss Marple and Inspector Cray sat in Inspector Cray's little office above the village police station, with the belladonna receipt resting on the desk between them. This would mean that she utilized an expired medication. According to Cray, this might be a suicide or a well-planned murder, because Miss Marple either said it or, more likely, convinced the chemist to do it, using her reputation and status. Looking up, Miss Marples realized that someone wanted her gone, but her response was either too gentle or too Cray. According to Miss Marple, she may have used the belladonna as a numbing agent or as bait for a trap, as she knew her time was limited. In her narrowed eyes, Craig wondered if someone was watching her or if she was being planned to be quietly killed. Miss Marple flashed the slightest smile, as if to say, "The most dangerous weapon is the one you never actually use, but merely leave close enough for someone desperate to consider." Even the village bells, which usually ring softly across the fields at 7 o'clock in the morning, appeared to pause before continuing to chime, as if the following morning had never happened before. After breakfast, Clara stood pale and composed a folded sheet of paper under a floorboard in the master bedroom. She said, without greeting, "I don't know why I checked, something just felt off." Miss Marple ushered her in and delicately took the sheet, which was handwritten in Sybil's unmistakable script. Seating herself by the hearth, Marple watched the steam rise from her teacup with the quiet concentration of someone tracing invisible lines on a map. The date was clear, on July 16th, the day before she passed away. I took precautions. If no one believes me, I trust Jane Marple. And if there is a will, I have buried the truth beneath pleasantries, where no man would dare to look beneath the skirts of the vicar's widow. Let them dig for riches. Under the skirts of the vicar's widow, Miss Marple slowly raised her brows, and whispered something to Clara, who sat down to hear what it meant. Lady Sybil stashed her updated will in an almost ridiculously obvious spot, where only a specific kind of lady would dare to look. According to Miss Marple, who stood resolutely, without hesitation, she walked up to her bookcase, ran her finger down the spines, and pulled out Saints and Spinsters. "Vicarish Women's Social History, Mrs. Vinton," she remarked, the former vicar's wife, a frightening woman past 3 years in her will, ago bequeathed her costume collection to the amateur theatre group of her village. Clara inquired about the theatre. Closet in the church hall, and when they got there, around midday, they found it deserted, save for a few stacked chairs and the faint aroma of lavender and mothballs. Miss Marple guided us to the rear storage area, where we retrieved a plethora of worn-out garments hung from a wardrobe. The key, which the parish had long since forgotten, was secured with a hairpin. A faded blue gown with a wide skirt that is modestly but stiffly embroidered is near the end of the procession. Miss Marple's hands, which are surprisingly agile for her age, patted, pressed, and, finally, lifted the hem. With a quiet extraction, she opened the flap, pulled out 3 pages that were typed and signed, and witnessed the revised will. A harsh gasp was exhaled by Miss Marple slipped the package into her handbag. "We'll deliver this to Inspector Cray, but not now." Clara looked shocked. "Why not?" "Because it's bait," Miss Marple whispered, "just like the belladonna." As a precaution, Sybil set up trails actively, traps to catch her pursuers, but they won't open unless someone freaks out. Clara's voice fell. You want them to believe the will is still undiscovered. We'll watch as they flee in terror and desperation. That afternoon at Marchmont House was tense. The battle had taken to pacing the halls like a man waiting for news. He couldn't bring himself to name Denham aloud, and he hardly looked up when he entered the drawing room. "I thought you were gone," he muttered. Elizabeth ignored him, threatening to cut you off. You know that he looked up sharply. "Is that why you've stayed?" Elizabeth hesitated as she turned to leave, her belief in Ellsworth unwavering. "If I were you, I would cease attempting to delete her. You are not nearly as intelligent as you believe." That night, Madame Marple visited Reverend Fallobe, posing as a book lover, in order to borrow morality and the middle-class mind. However, Marple took advantage of the opportunity to review the church records. She was particularly interested in finding out when Sybil last gave money, which was 2 days before she passed away. The amount was substantial, and there was a curious note included as a memento. In order to preserve the truth, Marple returned home and sat silently outside for nearly an hour, the wind picking up and blowing leaves across the garden path. She refrained from lighting the lamp, opting instead to wait until just before 10 o'clock. Suddenly, there was movement at the gate. A hooded figure slipped past and entered the side entrance of Marchmont House, bypassing the front door and entering. Through the garden, Marple stood across the village, in an outside Marchmont House's drawing room. Cray, Constable Miller, and Miss Marple stood, with an uncorked vial in one hand and a port bottle in the other. Basil Marchmont stood red-handed by the drinks cabinet. "I can explain," he began instantly. "Of course," Cray answered, "but I think we'd rather test what's left in that bottle first." Miss Marple saw Basil's expression, not because he was guilty, but because he was visibly frustrated. He had arrived at the site to repoison it, but the bottle he was holding wasn't the actual thing. It was a decoy. The true trap was already closing in on him. In Chapter 8, the forensic team collected the decoy bottle from Basil's study. Inspector Craig stood at the edge of the Marchmont garden, his gaze furrowed and his arms folded. Sitting on a velvet fabric within a cushioned case, undamaged and neatly sealed, was the object that Basil had fought so hard to acquire the night before. He had argued, almost feverishly, that he had merely wished to safeguard it, but his suspicions were aroused when Clara discovered that old receipt. Ungainly deception, ungainly timing with her coat buttoned high against the wind. Miss Marple arrived stealthily through the garden gate. Cray met her gaze as she approached, but he remained silent, simply repeating that he was protecting the family's reputation. Miss Marple nodded, as they often do when the truth becomes useless to them. As they made their way away from the home, Cray pointed to the garden wall, and the labs conducting the tests informed them. "But I'll tell you this. We checked the decanter. From the night Lady Sybil died, no belladonna, hardly any dirt or grime, clearly. Miss Marple wasn't startled by anything, and her expression betrayed her disapproval. So, what was the point of the receipt, the trap, and the belladonna?" With a gentle touch, Miss Marple allowed it to be seen that she had left the receipt, made inquiries, and possibly even hinted to the wrong person about her port consumption. Cray nodded slowly, and Basil followed her lead, believing that her death might be attributed to poison. Despite the lack of proof, the fear of discovery would draw him in. The real cause of death, according to Miss Marple's eyes, was heart failure, caused by stress, pressure, grief, fear, or her own attempts at self-medication, but not murder. Cray exhaled, and Basil's guilt accompanied by all this. He destroyed the new will, but it wasn't for the act itself. It was for his intentions. The solicitor confirmed that no draft was ever submitted the morning after Miss Marple's death, but Sybil foiled him by hiding a copy somewhere he wouldn't think to look, and now we have it. The original copy of the revised will was neatly folded on Miss Marble's lap as Clara sat in her parlour that afternoon. She didn't speak for a long time, but eventually said that she knew she didn't have long. Instead of asking for help, she built this whole performance, and Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. Craig said that he panicked because losing the house after her death and being seen interfering or tampering with the evidence would look worse than murder. Who could really blame her for continuing to orchestrate the lives of others? After surveyed the property, she bequeathed it to a historical trust, avoiding any involvement with me whatsoever. I imagine that's what Clara whispered, different type of inheritance, because Miss Marple said she left you the letters and diaries and a trust big enough to preserve them. Clara looked up at Miss Marple and asked, "What happens to him now?" She said that it depends on the results of the test. If they reveal that he tampered with the bottle, he will be charged with obstruction at the very least. And if the forgery is found, the consequences could be much more severe. Miss Marple reached out and gently touched Sybil's hand, and Sybil knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted her legacy to be a story that someone could finally tell, and she wanted it shielded from individuals like Battle. Inspector Cray, drenched in rain and wearing a coat, burst into the room, interrupting their conversation. We now know that the sample he brought last night included belladonna, albeit in a very small dose, just enough to raise eyebrows, and that his fingerprints were all over it. A weight lifted off Clara's shoulders as she asked, "And something else? The revised will and the letting go are in your office?" Cray inquired, to which Miss Marple responded, "And must be registered immediately." Looking over at Clara, Craig said, "You've been through quite a lot." With a weary nod, Clara said, "We all have." Cray looked at Miss Marple for a while before moving on. "Nobody has ever caught a man with a bottle he never even used before, Miss Marple. I've known smart people before." With a subtle smile, "Miss Marple, it is said that one can learn a lot by paying attention to people's silence." Afterwards, that night, Craig lowered his hat and left. As Miss Marple knitted in solitude by the cottage fire, she pondered the change in wind direction. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a dog barked once before going silent. In her final days, she had come to see civil marchesment, not as the icy matriarch that the village had whispered about, but as a woman cornered, who had relied on silence rather than speech, cunning rather than confession. Even though Shabil did not die violently, she did leave behind a murder that was on the verge of happening and exposed the person capable of carrying it out. Chapter 9. Much hemming and hawing persisted like a fog that wouldn't lift, even though the battle marchment scheme was falling apart. The villagers started to whisper things carefully at first, and then they started to confidently tell half-truths. However, nobody knew the whole story, and Miss Marple thought that something was still missing. After the will was found, Elizabeth Denholm withdrew from the house, asked the innkeeper for her bill, and refused any guests. Clara attempted once, but to no avail, and Inspector Cray tried twice, but to no avail either. So, on a wet, as Miss Marple walked slowly down the cobblestone lane to the inn on Thursday morning, Ellsworth sat alone by the window in the modest parlour, her suitcase resting at her feet. Ellsworth said, "I suppose you've come to ask what I didn't tell the inspector." But she didn't look up as Miss Marple entered. Miss Marple removed her gloves carefully. "No, my dear, I've come to ask what Sybil told you." Elizabeth, whose voice was low because she knew she was dying but had been keeping it hidden, gazed out over the rain-soaked town square and declared that her condition was getting worse so that no one would feel sorry for her. Miss Marple sat silently, allowing the silence to lengthen. "Did she ask anything of you?" "She told me to keep an eye on Basil, that's all, and to stay until everything was done." "She didn't explain, but I understood. Did you stay?" "Yes, I did. I watched him go through her desk and burn something in the fireplace the morning after, a pale blue document. I didn't stop him because I was afraid." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But you didn't leave either." "I stayed because she asked, and I owed her." Elizabeth's normally composed eyes revealed something raw. "You might think she forgave me for what happened in Tanger." She, Tanger Elbath, averted her gaze as Miss Marple arched an eyebrow. "I loved someone a long time ago," she said, "and Sybil loved someone else, but he chose me." Until a month ago, she remained silent and stopped writing. Her voice carried a hint of pain, not new but old and reopened. Miss Marple had asked you to return, and now she had entrusted you with her final game. Elizabeth breathed a trembling breath, unable to let go of anything, not revenge, not love. "It seems that Miss Marple finally put her trust in you because you noticed that she hesitated at the threshold. After all, you were not the only eyewitness." That afternoon, Ellsworth Sybil was with a legal order in hand. Inspector Cray made his way to Marchmont House. Basil Marchmont, who was restrained by a solicitor's advice and was visibly distressed, was summoned for questioning in Guildingford, but he refused to speak. With the charges of tampering, obstruction, attempted poisoning, and holding, Craig stated that it will hold. With his arms crossed, Clara stood by the library window. He refused to confess to her death, and he didn't feel the need to listen to Miss Marple's explanation from the armchair. Clara was taken aback, but he had always intended to kill. Miss Marple gently interrupted, pointing out that he had followed her instructions to the letter, tried to conceal evidence, and even tried to control the narrative. However, his efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, and he was found guilty of trying. Reverend Fallowby served tea with quiet hands and didn't ask questions. They sat together in the study, with the old clock ticking between them. Clara whispered, guilty of waiting too long and assuming she wouldn't outwit him. Sybil knew her. Killer's conscience would crumble faster than her health. Later that evening, Miss Marple visited the vicarage again, but this time to reflect, rather than to investigate. She wasn't a kind woman, he said, but she understood people because she was honest and brutally honest. Gray nodded grimly. By responding to their fears and uncovering their secrets, Miss Marple was able to safeguard her heritage. He nodded, acknowledging a peculiar morality. As the sun began to set, Miss Marple made her way home, her knitting undone and the letter Sybil had written to her stashed in her drawer. Jane Marble had faith in the letter, but not because of it. Rather, it was her ability to discern a pattern beneath the surface, revealing the fingerprints of fear, long-suppressed resentment, and calculated delay. Now that the battle had broken out, the revised will had been filed away, and Sybil's last moves had been revealed. The mystery was nearly solved, but there was still one unanswered question. Why had Sybil waited for so long? Miss Marple had a strong intuition that the answer had less to do with Division 10. Rain fell again the next morning, not the showy kind that swept through villages and sheets, but a persistent drizzle that seemed determined to soak into stone, soil, and skin alike. Much dithering moved slower under such weather. The baker opened an hour late. The postmistress delayed sorting her letters, but Miss Marple was up early, standing in the cold grey light of her drawing room, watching it all, Sybil Marchmont's plan. had worked neatly, bitterly, and with astonishing foresight. Basil was caught cornered. Not by an act of violence, but by his reaction to a trap he believed was real that had been Sybil's genius. She made him reveal himself without ever needing to accuse him, and yet a shadow remained. The truth felt nearly whole, and yet something in Miss Marple's mind, a quiet dissonance, suggested otherwise. Not a new mystery, but an old one. Sybil had chosen never to name the missing thread. She suspected lay not in what Sybil had done, but in what she had never explained. She left her cottage after breakfast and walked the narrow lane to the Guildingford Parish Archive, a seldom used annex beside the county courthouse. The building smelled of damp stone and old ink, and its only clerk, a man named Mr. Purvis, looked surprised to see anyone at all. "I'm hoping to consult your property." He dutifully guided her to a back room replete with ledgers as thick as tombstones. After an hour of searching, she finally located the Marchmont House transfer of Title 1919 document, which pertains to deeds, transfers, land registry, and anything else old enough to have dust on it. Surprisingly, the paper bears the signature of Sybil Markman's mother, Margaret Ellenholm Marchmont, rather than her father or husband. Marble's fingers came to a halt. After much hemming and hawing, Elizabeth Denholm, far from a travel companion and more like a sister, shut the book, the tempest raging within her, mirroring the rain outside. In Marchmont House's drawing room, Clara sorted through the few unopened possessions. Among them was a jewelry box with a broken clasp, a silver thimble, and an old, fragile newspaper cutting with a headline, "Family Tragedy in Tangier Young. Soldier drowns during diplomatic visit." She felt her pulse quicken as she saw the name beneath the photo. No one has been prosecuted with the same name, and the story describes the death of a British liaison officer stationed in Morocco under suspicious circumstances. Captain Graham Fielding was not a friend of his. On the night that Miss Marple returned to her cottage, Clara was already there. She lied, Clara said, passing over the clipping. She went on to say that she and Sybil had once competed for a man, but she never brought up the fact that they were related, or that Sybil had mumbled something in her sleep weeks before she passed away. The two women named in the piece were Miss Sybil Marchmont and Miss Elizabeth Denholm. Miss Marple took the clipping and nodded. Sybil didn't want it known she carried shame. Like other people, carry handbags, close, discreet, and never far from reach. Clara's voice trembled. "You think one of them else or Sybil was involved in this man's death, I think." Miss Marple said carefully that Sybil never forgave, not because of Graham Fielding's death, but because of the lie afterward. Whatever happened in Tangier fractured their bond. Sybil may have carried the burden silently, but she never forgot then. Why ask her back? Because in the end, Miss Marple said Sybil needed her not as a friend, as a witness, someone who knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively or otherwise, someone who could anchor her story. Once she was gone, Clara sat down stunned, and Elizabeth did that she did not. Out of loyalty, out of guilt, a knock came at the door. Inspector Cray entered, reins slicking his coat. "I have news," he said without preamble. Basil's solicitor just handed over a letter from Sybil, never mailed but addressed to Ellsworth, dated a week before her death. Presented to Miss Marple by him, even if it hurts. We both must tell the truth to the girl, and not him or myself. The letter was brief, but you'll eventually come, won't you? You said we buried the truth too deep, and now I believe it's time to dig it out. Miss Marple carefully read it twice before folding it. She clarified that she was referring to Clara, and Clara immediately froze. "Could you please clarify what you mean?" Miss Marple leaned in and spoke softly. "My darling, your mother passed away when you were young. The records aren't clear, but Sybil never officially adopted you. She just raised you." Clara parted her lips to protest. "Are you saying Elizabeth is your mother?" Miss Marple muttered under her breath, "I would have known she never gave you to Sybil." Clara shook her head in disapproval. "Maybe after Graham's death, or perhaps as a result of this, Sybil raised you as her own, using the situation as an excuse to assert her dominance and seek redemption. Sybil raised Clara, made sure she couldn't reclaim her, and even in death." Clara sat silently, didn't cry, and whispered, "I think I understand now why she never hugged me." Cray stepped back in shock, realizing that the entire inheritance was her way of sealing the past and controlling the story. She cut Elizabeth out of the will, not out of anger, but to find closure. Chapter 11 opens with a gentle mist rising over the ponderous village. The following morning, the boundary between earth and sky became more blurred, and the mystery seemed to be settling down. However, there was an uneasy silence, as if something significant was about to happen. Marple sat down with Inspector Cray again, this time in the Marchmont drawing room. Basil, who was officially charged with attempted concealment of a will and obstruction of justice, remained silent. Above, in the bedroom that Clara had thought belonged to an unknown individual, now sits on the bedside table with a small music box that Sybil had stashed in her nightstand. The box no longer played, but within lay a solitary pearl, mysteriously undone. As she spins the pearl between her fingers, her mind wanders away from issues of betrayal and inheritance and towards something of more ancient origin. Cray read aloud the final letter from Sybil's bureau drawer, which was once believed to be empty. Craig set the letter down and commented, "There's a pattern in her tone." Matter of fact, she always clipped this last one to the family solicitor. Cray hesitated and said, "Should anything occur, I entrust Miss Jane Marple to provide the necessary clarity." Sybil had given her name directly. As Sybil turned to the window and Clara sat sick, Miss Marple nodded. She knew the importance of truth, but she didn't find solace in it. Instead, she favored justice in its most regal form, no matter the cost. The protagonist, Miss Marple, spoke softly about her upbringing in the shadows, but also about how her two mothers had tried, in their own broken ways, to shield her from harm. Despite all the obstacles, including a destroyed will, a staged poisoning, and motive manipulation, her death was still caused by natural causes. Craig's eyebrow arched as she died peacefully, knowing that she had been the victim of a trap. "Saw the storm coming, and I positioned every piece of my life where it needed to fall. I left no loose ends," Miss Marple said. Cray paused to consider the possibility that then this is the end of it. Everything was designed to preserve her authority after death. But now Clara knows the truth, and she have to decide whether to live under Sybil's name or step out from beneath it. Miss Marple continued as she stepped slowly to the mantel and tapped a finger on the marble. The artwork above the fireplace depicted Sybil in oils, and the artist had captured not warmth but command. Basil had used the same fireplace to burn what he believed to be the only copy of the revised ill will, but now what's left behind? With her pearls still in her hand, Clara stepped gracefully into the room. "I've made a decision," she said with a firm voice. "The estate will go to the historical trust as she intended. I will keep the diaries and personal papers, but not the house. I refuse to live inside someone else's narrative." "That is correct," Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I believe Clara purposefully left the pearl unfinished, just like the truth between her and Else when she held it out to her. Miss Marple handled it delicately. Occasionally, The missing jewel is not a result of loss, but of Craig's choosing. Thus, there were no covert killings and no unanswered questions. Turning to face him, Miss Marple, in those years that followed. Craig nodded slowly, letting the weight of the murder sink in. Oh, Inspector, the murder had never reached the body, only the heart. As they stepped out onto the front lawn, Clara was escorted by Miss Marple. The light was just breaking through the fog, casting a longing shadow over the ancient home behind them. "Do you believe she loved me?" Clara asked, her voice trailing off. Clara inquired, "Yes, Miss Marple," and Miss Marple responded without hesitation in the only way she knew, how proudly and without mercy. As for Elizabeth, she remained by her side, watching as the wind swept through the hedge and sent a single leaf tumbling to the step below. "What are you going to do now, Miss Marple?" Clara asked. Clara put forward, "I'll go back to my knitting," she responded, "and let the village return to its quiet. It's earned a rest, don't you think?" With a subtle grin, Clara said, "Yes, I believe we all have." The air was getting warmer as summer drew near, and the hedge shimmered with green, as if nature had tried to erase the memory of recent events. But peace, as Miss Marple knew all too well, was not the absence of trouble, but the echo that followed. Chapter 12 was filled with much hemming and hawing. His legal team advocated for his silence, but he was sent to a holding facility close to Guildingford, since the charges of attempted fraud, obstruction, and destruction of a legal document warranted a formal trial. Even across county borders, the scandal was beginning to spread. Silence was no longer an option for Clara, as the hamlet responded in its typical manner, with polite discussions winding down to subdued tones, glances exchanged over teacups, and the implicit awareness that such things usually happened to families like the Marchmonts, never to themselves. The following morning, she personally delivered the updated will to the solicitor's office, her shoulders back and her eyes fixed on the task at hand. When asked if there was anything she wanted to challenge, she replied, "No, the truth stands." The news had spread by midday that Marchmont House would no longer be in the family's possession. Instead, it would be part of a heritage trust. Tours would be organized. Letters and Sybil's extensive correspondence would be archived for public study. An exhibition would be planned, and historians would be invited. The past would no longer be kept private. That night, Elizabeth Denham arrived at Miss Marble's door, looking exhausted from a way that grief alone could not explain. She had no suitcase this time, so she whispered, "I'm not leaving." Miss Marple invited her in, and the two women sat by the hearth, neither of them needing to immediately fill the silence. "I wasn't a mother," Elizabeth confessed. "I let Sybil raise Clara because I thought I couldn't, because I thought love wasn't enough if it came from shame. But now Clara knows she does," Miss Marple said, her tea being stirred slowly. "Sybil believed that control would succeed where love failed." Elizabeth nodded. "We were both mistaken." "Not through you," Miss Marple clarified softly. "Past you, she's still deciding whether she wants to look back." Elizabeth stood silently in the square, her hands folded in her lap as she twisted the edge of her scarf. "If Elizabeth never does, you should remain calm and not make any demands. Maybe she'll decide to visit you again later that week." Elizabeth's voice cracked slightly, while trimming the rosemary bush across the lane. The vicar stood politely in his garden, waving politely, with pruning shears in one hand. "Quiet week, Miss Marple," he called out. "Oh yes," she replied, "the kind of quiet one earns." The letter was unsigned, but its tone was clear. Miss Marple folded and pressed it between the pages of her gardening journal. On that Sunday, the church bells rang freely once again. Clara sat alone in the back, her unflinching eyes fixed on the congregation. The villagers glanced and whispered, but then returned to their hymn books. Clara sang every verse, and then she silently left. Elizabeth stood beneath the yew tree outside, waiting, but Clara passed her without slowing down. At the gate, Clara turned around and said, "I'm not ready." Elizabeth answered, "I know." After Clara left, Elizabeth returned to her embroidery. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a gentle glow across the village, the stillness was broken only by her thoughts. The ripple effect of Sybil's decisions could still be felt, though not in a destructive or even audible way. Rather, they settled like dust, like memories or truth, and even though justice had been served, they lingered on, rather than the scandal, the estate, or even her vengeance. The peace that Sybil Markman left behind was her greatest legacy. After 2 weeks of the Marchmont scandal fading into oblivion, the hamlet's residents resumed discussing mundane topics like gardening and weather. The post office went back to its usual routine, and although the scandal was still being discussed, it felt like a chapter was coming to a close. However, a few endings still needed signatures to be finalized. On that particular morning, Miss Marple stood outside the solicitor's office, clutching her gloves in one hand, as the gentlest wind ruffled the edges of her coat within. The revised will has been certified as authentic, confirmed by Partridge, witnessed, and legally uncontested. Now that Mr. Basil Marchmont has resisted all counterclaims through his counsel, Clara nodded, indicating that the trust takes possession. However, your role as literary custodian remains unchanged. Madame Marchmont, as per the conditions your aunt specified, you are authorized to handle the family archives, letters, and diaries. Clara replied softly after a moment of hesitation, "I will keep them, but I will see to it that the story is told." Partridge arched an eyebrow, and whatever form that takes outside, it is a biography, a truth, and she rectified it. With an unreadable expression on her face, Clara stepped out of the building and straight towards Ellsworth across the green. There was no embrace, no tearful reunion, but Clara paused in front of the older woman, looked into her eyes, and simply said, "Let's talk." Miss Marple watched as this young woman moved with grace and dignity. With a smile, Reverend Fallowby looked up as Clara entered the church, and he said, "She's found peace," then he asked. They continued their walk past the baker, the vicarage, and the spot where Sybil's portrait still hung in the manor's main hallway. The tour would soon include this location. Miss Marple turned towards the church. "After she's found a place to begin," Miss Marple said, "peace may take longer." The vicar tilted his head. "And she's waited long enough now, she'll need to wait a little more." As she crossed the street to the stationer's shop, Miss Marple left him to his songs and read the County Observer from the window. Her eye was drawn to a little column tucked away at the bottom of page 3. Probation and bequest forfeiture for Basil Marchmont. The Marchmont estate has been transferred to the county's Historical Preservation Trust per the terms of the authenticated will, and Basil Marchmont, heir to the late Lady Sybil Marchmont, will not face a custodial sentence. According to the ruling today by the Guildingford Magistrates' Court, this decision follows the court's recognition that Marchmont's dishonest actions did not directly cause his mother's death, and the Marchmont estate has been fully revoked. Little disturbance in her cottage. There is no portrait, no drama, simply the last seal on a heritage that was once fiercely guarded but is now surrendered to history. In spite of the mild weather, Miss Marple lit a small fire. She retrieved the last pearl, the one Clara had given her, and delicately set it in a ceramic dish next to her chair. The point was that it would never be strung. That was the point. Later, while she sat quietly working on her embroidery, Inspector Cray entered the room with his customary unhurried confidence, holding a folded sheet in his hand. He said, "Coroner's final statement on Lady Civil Marchmont." Lady Marchmont silently accepted the document, which read, "Cause of death, natural cardiac failure. The investigation revealed no signs of external toxins, suspicious substances in the bloodstream, or foul play. Belladonna was found on the property but not consumed," and Craig poured himself a cup of tea while Miss Marple played a lengthy game, correcting her mistakes along the way. She left just enough rope for guilt to pull taut while ensuring no blood was shed. Despite this, Craig claimed that she died with enemies and a secret. According to what Miss Marple claimed, she made sure it lasted long enough to make the remaining people change. While Cray sipped his tea, she asked if he ever gets sick of being right. He said no, but he does take breaks between cases. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a shadow over the thatched rooftops of the village, Clara and another walked down the lane. This time, though Clara held the diary that Sybil had kept in her last year. Quietly, she passed it to Elizabeth, and the two of them continued to walk above them. Below them, the sky turned violet, and the past remained preserved. Now, in pages, rooms, memories, and the peaceful hum of a village that had been momentarily reminded of how truth clings to the living much after the dead have let it go. Chapter 14. Marchmont's house underwent gradual transformation. Elizabeth would sometimes come quietly, other times just to sit nearby. They hadn't brought up Tangier yet, but whenever the light would change or a certain song would play on the old gramophone, Clara would look up and everyone else would look back. It was a start of permission, not understanding, in the village. The scandal faded, as all scandals do. It became a Marchmont, as people would say when referring to private disgrace concealed by public manners. Miss Marple, on the other hand, returned to the rhythms of her life with practiced grace. Her roses bloomed late but richly, and her needlepoint returned to its original subject, baby bonnets for the church charity. She visited the bakery every Tuesday and the vicarage every other Thursday, seemingly normal, but she knew no neatly wrapped body with a visible wound. Rather, it was a gradual disintegration of connections, of self-perception, of the truth that had been kept from too many people for too long, and yet, somehow, it had all been resolved. That week, Miss Marple received a final letter in the mail, written in a recognizable hand and addressed to her from the battlefield. Unsurprisingly, she opened the letter. "I take it you think you've won, at least in your own mind. I won't fight the court's decision because what's the point? The house is gone, the name is disgraced, and Sybil's legacy is handed over to white-gloved strangers. You should know that I didn't poison her, though I wanted to and planned to. You were always going to believe the worst of me, just like she did. Can you say the same about the others?" Marchmont Basil. After reading it twice, Miss Marple folded it and tucked it away in her filing tin, labeling it miscellaneous correspondence. Later that afternoon, as she strolled through the churchyard, she noticed that the late-blooming foxglove phlox and last-ditch hydrangeas were near the newer graves. While Miss Marple drew near, Clara stayed steadfastly by Sybil grave, a delicate scarf tucked into her coat collar. She whispered softly, that Sybil was never laid to rest with a poem, simply her name and the dates. No parting remarks without a lasting impact, even in quiet. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on the stone that represented her path. My previous belief that love had to be fluffy and romantic like in books was shattered when Clara let out a breath. Perhaps love is more like a hug, even when it aches. Do you think she was afraid? Clara said, her gaze falling to the ground as Miss Marple nodded subtly. Love often hides inside duty and sometimes inside regret. After a lengthy pause, Clara finally spoke out. I think I'll publish her diaries. Not all of them, but enough so the world should know who she really was. This brought up Miss Marple's points about being forgotten or remembered for the wrong reasons. After a while, Miss Marple's face softened, and she said, I will live again, not in marble. They lingered in the afternoon silence at her cottage for a while longer. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, Miss Marple sat by the window, sipping a cup of tea and reflecting on the events that had unfolded. She had been diligently working on a blanket sheet since the garden fete, the day Sybil announced her changes. The rows were neatly folded and the yarn was warm, and she had finished stitching it. The legacy had been rewritten, with no bloodshed or shouted violence, just a gradual unraveling of truths, pieced together one quiet thread at a time. For Miss Marple, murder was never just about death. Sometimes it was a matter of silence, a secret buried too deep, a goodbye whispered without ever being spoken.